other than really a tremendously influential person in my life and my career. I had the honor of knowing him when I was at Caltech for a glorious few years back in the early 2000s. I can't believe, John, it was been 20 years since we first met. And it's none other than John Preskill, who is joining us today from from Pasadena, California. John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's really good to see you, Brian.
It's great to see you. I can't tell you how much it means that you're on the show. You're, basically my most requested guest that I get on a frequent basis. Although we're branching into alternative topics now. We just had on our first show about Bitcoin, and we will talk about quantum cryptography, and we will talk about cryptocurrency and all sorts of things. So just for those out there, what are the promises and pitfalls, perhaps, of things that John has made foundational contributions to? But I really wanted to start off by talking about what the nature of your research is and how people can learn more about your research. We figured that we would kind of discuss the implications and the applications of quantum computing to fundamental physics. My audience is very astute. They know a lot about quantum mechanics and about issues related to quantum mechanics. But can you give a quick update on quick summary? How do you think about a quantum computer? What is the essence of a quantum computer to John Preskill?
Well, it's a device which makes use of quantum mechanics to achieve big speed ups compared to classical computers for solving certain classes of problems. And the types of problems for which a quantum computer is particularly well suited is uh, characterizing the behavior of quantum systems. So from my point of view as a physicist, and with a background in particle physics, the way I think about this whole field of quantum information is that we are in the early stages of exploring a new frontier of the physical sciences. You know very well, Brian, that if I want to go more deeply into the early history of the universe, as you do in your work, then we build more powerful instruments. Or if we want to explore the structure of matter on shorter and shorter distance scales, we build more powerful um, particle accelerators. And if we want to explore matter as it becomes more and more highly complex, that's what we can do with the quantum computer. Because when we have many particles interacting quantum mechanically, states become very entangled. That's the word we use for the characteristic correlations among parts of a quantum system. And with ordinary computers, we just can't simulate the behavior of highly entangled matter efficiently, and that opens opportunities for discovery. So sometimes I speak of the entanglement frontier or complexity frontier, because we would like to go more and more deeply into the behavior of these very highly entangled states. And a quantum computer is the instrument, if you like, which will allow us to do that.
And when you think about the fundamental paradigm of biology, it might be evolution progressing by encoding of information via DNA. And in cosmology, it's characterized the universe characterized on large scales by isotropy, homogeneity. Is there a fundamental theorem or catechism of quantum computing, or is it still, as Cho En-lai said of the French Revolution in the 1970s, too soon to tell?
Well, there's sort of a fundamental principle of computational science, which sometimes people call the Church Turing thesis, which is that we should be able, with a computer that's universal, that can do any computation, to efficiently simulate anything that happens in nature. And that's not something that we can prove. It's a statement about physics, really, but it was a widely accepted principle until the advent of quantum computing. Because we don't think with the standard model of computation, the Turing machine model, that we can efficiently simulate very highly entangled matter. But with a quantum computer, we think that is possible, that with a quantum computer, as far as we know, we should be able to efficiently simulate any process that occurs in nature. And so we need to update that Church-Turing thesis, replace it by a quantum Church-Turing thesis. And so I would say our operating principle when we think about using quantum computers to explore nature is that if it happens in nature, we have the hubris to believe that we can simulate it with computers that we understand in principle how to build. But if we want to do those simulations efficiently, they'll have to be quantum computers.
So I've said, actually getting a couple of comments in the chat that your audio is still a little on the low side, John. Is there a way you can either move closer or is that that's an external microphone? Is there a way? Do you have an internal microphone? If you just disconnected the, let's see if that would work.
Well,
that's already better, actually. I don't know what you
did. Okay. Well, I don't think I did anything.
All right.
I turned my head. Let's see. The microphone is.
Yeah, the closer you can get to the microphone, the better. People are.
All right. How about? I got it a little closer to my face now.
Oh, that's much better. Yeah, people are asking if this is quantum audio, they don't want it. So the future better be not this level of audio quality. Apologies for that, everybody. But we're here with John Preskill on the Into the Impossible.
Boy, you guys missed some really great stuff.
Yeah, I know. We'll never repeat it. No, we got all of it, and it's just the audio is just a little inconsistent. There's a little bit of background. But anyway, we're here with John Preskill, Into the Impossible podcast. Please do subscribe to the channel. Exercise your finger. John will tell you that carpal tunnel syndrome is rampant. The best exercise is to press every couple of seconds the like button, the thumbs up button, and subscribe. But also subscribe to my newsletter at briankeating.com. I'll send you some resources from this conversation with John. We're going to talk about really some exciting developments in fundamental physics. So we talked a little bit about the fundamentals of quantum computing, maybe what the fundamental theorem of quantum calculus is in comparison to cosmology and other branches of science. I've heard it said, and this is all with due respect intended, that the only thing that quantum computers are good for is cryptography and simulating quantum computers. What would you say after you punch someone in the face who would say that to you? What would you say to such a person?
Well, I would say we have a very limited understanding of what quantum computers will be able to do. We don't expect quantum computers to be able to efficiently solve all the problems we might care about, far from it. In particular, the problems that the computer scientists call NP-hard or NP-complete, the hardest problems among those for which we can verify the solution once we find it. Quantum computers can speed up finding solutions to such problems just by speeding up the exhaustive search for a solution, but they don't speed that up so dramatically that it will really, change the world. So it is special problems with the right structure for which quantum computers have a very large advantage, for which the speed up that you can achieve is essentially exponential. You can have a problem whose solution takes a time which is exponential in the size of the problem on a classical computer, and in some cases solve that far more efficiently in a time that just scales like a power the size of the problem. So that's where quantum advantage is really spectacular. And you mentioned the two examples which are most prominently known, the application to cryptology and the application to quantum physics. Now, it's likely there will be many others, but I think partly because we have limited imagination and limited understanding of the power of quantum computing, we haven't, as theorists, done a very good job so far in identifying a much broader class of application areas. And in a way, maybe that's not so surprising. In the case of classical computation, there are many examples of algorithms which theorists weren't able to promise would be powerful, but by experimentation, it was found that they work quite well. When we have quantum computers to experiment with, which are of sufficient scale that they can start to solve hard problems, we'll have the opportunity to try out heuristic ideas for quantum speedups and see how well they work. And the hope, which we can't guarantee, is that will open a lot of other potential applications, which can be very impactful on society. But for me as a physicist, even if what quantum computers turn out to be best suited for is simulating quantum physics, that's already a very powerful and interesting application, not just for advancing science, but I think for practical applications, at least in the long run. We're not sure how far off in the future I'm talking about, in discovering new materials and new types of chemical catalysts and so on. So those applications are part of what propels the interest in the field. But realistically, that's going to require a much more powerful quantum computer than we currently have, and it might still be decades away before we'll see that kind of impact. As for cryptology, well, of course, you know that what generated great excitement already over 25 years ago was in 1994 when Peter Shor discovered that with a quantum computer we can speed up greatly solutions to some number of theoretic problems, like finding the prime factors of a large composite integer. And because the public key crypto schemes, which we now all use in our daily lives to protect our privacy when we communicate over the internet, since those are founded on the assumption that certain computational problems are too hard to solve in practice, that's going to be upended when quantum computers are widely available. I think, so the world is going to have to adjust to that, and we can talk about that more if you like. I think as the world adjusts, that application will sort of recede in importance. It's sort of a historical accident, I expect, that quantum computers came along at a time when these public key schemes were in widespread use, and there are alternatives that we'll use in the future to replace those schemes. We'll still be able to protect our privacy in ways that are not vulnerable to attack by quantum computers. And then the application which will really impact the world that we are confident about and understand reasonably well is the application to characterizing and simulating quantum systems.
And when we look at quantum systems, I find most remarkable, although I'm a complete neophyte in this field, and I just look at it with admiration and respect for both the enthusiasm of the people working in this field, which is quite different than your early work as a grad student with Steven Weinberg and your contributions you made to topological defects, to magnetic monopoles and cosmology. And we'll get to cosmology, I hope, and black holes and your relationship with Stephen Hawking and the many bets you guys engage with. But I do want to point out that from this novice's perspective, one of the most remarkable things about quantum computing is that it can be done at all, because either we use the properties of single quantum systems, individual electrons, their spins or something, or collectives in persistent currents and phases and quantum and qubits. We use Josephson junction superconducting quantum interference devices, squid amplifiers in our microwave background research. What's the most remarkable thing to you? Is it that we can manipulate both megascopic, macroscopic, and the microscopic, or is there something else that really betwixes you and really stokes your curiosity about this particular field of quantum mechanics?
Well, it was also important that when the idea of quantum computing came along and when the recognition grew that quantum computers would be able, in principle, theoretically, to solve hard problems we couldn't otherwise solve, the developments in experimental physics were poised to take us into the era where real quantum hardware could be constructed. When decades ago, when one talked about doing experiments with quantum systems, they were almost always ensemble experiments where, say, if you were trying to describe the behavior of an atom or doing a nuclear magnetic resonance or something like that, you were looking at a signal from many atoms or many electron spins and so on. But, by the 1990s, we had the tools to manipulate quite accurately to control single quantum systems like single atoms. And technology was developed in part because it was motivated by the desire to make more accurate atomic clocks, like trapped ion technology, for example. But it's also very well suited for doing quantum computing, where one needs to be able to control individual qubits, or even more importantly, the interactions between pairs of qubits meaning the quantum analog of bits, quantum bits, which we call qubits, two atoms, for example. It's possible with lasers and using the vibrational modes, for example, of ions in a trap, to control quite precisely the interaction between two trapped ions, and therefore to do an elementary step in a quantum computation. By putting together many such operations, you can build up, in principle, computations of arbitrary complexity if you can perform those operations with sufficient accuracy, with good enough control. So it's nice that technology came along, or was starting to be available, just at the time that we recognized the potential of quantum computing. And the promise of quantum computing has continued to drive the technological developments, which have become more and more sophisticated, with the goal in mind of scaling up quantum computers to devices that can really solve interesting problems. But that technology can have other spin-offs as well, like better approaches to metrology, more sensitive sensors of various kinds, and potentially to the cryptographic applications as well.
Yeah, so these are all phenomenal applications, and I think some of them are less well known than others. I am getting another request to have you move a little bit closer to the microphone, and I think eventually you'll give up as you start crashing into the screen of your computer. But if you can move a little bit closer, I think that would be great. I will get closer to the microphone myself, although I am pretty close as it is right now. So people are asking about, yes, the implication for things like quantum supremacy. That has been a term that you coined and used, and I think probably misunderstood. First, before we get into applications or perhaps the prospects for quantum supremacy, both inside of physics and maybe outside of science altogether, in cryptography and banking, et cetera, can you explain what you mean by quantum supremacy? And how it should be used, maybe how it shouldn't be used. What are your thoughts for the audience about this term that you coined many years ago?
Well, I think one of the most remarkable things that we've understood about the difference between quantum and classical systems is what I made reference to earlier when I spoke of the quantum Church-Turing thesis, that we think that in general you can't efficiently simulate a quantum system using any classical system. I think that's one of the most interesting things we've ever said about how quantum is different from classical. And so there's a strong incentive to try to validate that in the laboratory, in a real experiment, to the extent that we can. And so I suggested that as a challenge for the field to do experiments which indicated that we could do something with the quantum device which surpasses what we could do with our most powerful classical computers. And I called that quantum supremacy. The the concept was not new at the time that I proposed it, of course, but I wanted, it's nice to have, to frame the challenge in kind of a concrete way. And, various experimental groups and companies took on that challenge, and with some fanfare, the Google group announced in late 2019 that that they had achieved what they asserted was a demonstration of quantum supremacy. They built a very interesting piece of hardware in the Google AI Quantum Lab based on superconducting technology, not that different from the technology you use in your detectors. The magic coming from the wonderful Josephson junction, which makes things sufficiently nonlinear that the quantum physics becomes interesting. And using that technology, they built a device with 53 qubits, and they were able to perform a sequence of entangling gates which cause neighboring qubits in a two-dimensional array to interact with one another, up to 20 layers of such two-qubit gates, where in each of those time steps, all of the qubits were participating in the gates that were applied. And then they measured all the qubits. And it's a rather noisy device, far from perfect. So when they measure, most of the time they get junk. But maybe a few times out of 1,000, they get a useful result. And then they can run that computation millions of times in just a few minutes in order to boost the signal to noise and get some statistically useful information from the experiment. And then you could imagine trying to simulate what that device is doing on a classical computer. And it's possible, but it's sufficiently challenging that classical computation would take far longer than the few minutes that it took Google's device to do the same task. So I like to call it quantum David versus classical Goliath, because the classical supercomputer covers a couple of basketball courts, and it's using megawatts of power. And Google's device is just, a little chip in a dilution refrigerator, more of a desktop scale experiment. And yet that little chip is doing something that big, powerful supercomputer, I wouldn't quite say can't do, but it would take far longer for the supercomputer to duplicate the task. And so that was more or less what I envisioned when speaking of quantum supremacy. Now, that's not to say that it's of any practical importance that demonstration was achieved. The particular task that the Google device carried out is not something that we particularly care about for any reason other than demonstrating the quantum supremacy. But I still consider it to be kind of a milestone in technology, that we've sort of entered the era where quantum devices potentially are capable of doing things that we couldn't otherwise do, even with our most powerful classical computers.
Yeah, so one of my guests are folks in the chat room. I want to point out we're talking with legendary physicist, the Richard Feynman Professor of Physics at the California Institute of Technology, which is a small technical college in Pasadena, California, where I've spent some of my time. This is Beavers Week on the Into the Impossible podcast. We had Frank Wilczek on Monday. We had Michael Saylor, MIT alum, on Wednesday, or Tuesday and Wednesday, respectively. And now we've got Beaver from the West Coast, none other than my friend and really a mentor in many ways, that he looks at physics the way that I would like to someday see it. I call John kind of the Chuck Yeager. I'm a pilot, John. I don't know if you remember that, but All pilots emulate the late great Chuck Yeager. We're talking air traffic control, and we're saying we're going to go to the northwest sector, and we try to emulate. Well, physicists, we try to emulate you, John. You don't have to respond to that, but I am.
I will say The Right Stuff is one of my favorite books, and the
Yes.
part about Yeager is the best part.
Yes, it is lovely. But I want to point out, we're going to take some questions now. We're raising donations. It's not required by any means, but for a very lovely program called, or institution called the Foothill Unity Center. This is in Southern California. And I think this is a phenomenal organization. So any of the super chats, I will double the super chats up to 1 Bitcoin. No, I won't go that high, but I'll double it up to several $100s. So hopefully we can get that. This is for some of the people who have great needs in this time of challenge and needs, and this is the charity that John has selected to donate the proceeds from this generous use of his time on the Into the Impossible podcast. So I've got it up on the screen now. So we're showing the organization. You put a donation in the super chat, and I will double it and send it to the Foothill Unity Center. John, thank you for alerting me to that to this wonderful cause. So going back to questions from the audience, one is asked by one of my most loyal guests. His screen name is 6bob-ohms, and he wants me to ask you about the physical versus logical number of qubits for a useful machine. I guess this is, what is the minimum number of physical versus logical number of qubits for a useful machine, a machine that can do things that classical computers would be less efficient at?
Yeah, well, let me explain what I think is being asked here in the distinction between physical and logical qubit. As I mentioned, in, for example, this Google device, the hardware, although impressive, is still quite noisy. And that's a serious limitation on the scale of the computations that you can do. Because if you try to perform a computation with hardware that's so imperfect, with a large number of qubits or with many operations with many gates, there will be no signal to noise. The imperfections will completely wipe out any useful result. And so if we're going to use quantum computers to solve really hard problems, we have to somehow solve that problem to reduce the noise. And potentially, someday we'll be able to do that by making much, much, much better quantum hardware than we have now. I think someday we will do that. But there's another approach, which is more of a software approach, what we call quantum error correction. And in quantum error correction, we use many physical qubits to represent a single so-called logical qubit, where the logical qubit is much more reliable, can be manipulated much more accurately than the single qubit. And just to provide some context, quantum computing is really hard.
Yes.
And that's why we've only gotten as far as we have so far. And there are several things that make it hard. But perhaps the most formidable problem is what we call decoherence, which is an important principle in physics that, of course, classical physics is what we use to describe what we experience in everyday life, and it works extremely well. And yet, underneath it all, we think the world is quantum mechanical. Quantum mechanics holds sway at the scale of atoms, but at the scale of humans, it doesn't seem to be that important. And the reason for that is this phenomenon of decoherence, which makes quantum systems behave classically, to be well described by classical physics, which is fine because our lives would be much stranger if we were quantum mechanical at a human scale, although I'm sure that would be fun. But for a quantum computer, it's really bad news because decoherence can make a quantum computer behave like a classical one, and all that magic that makes the quantum computer more powerful would be lost. And this decoherence occurs because we can't stop the quantum system, or it's very hard to stop the quantum system from interacting with the outside world. And this is really a manifestation of the uncertainty principle in a way, that if you acquire information about a quantum system, then you have to damage the system. And even if we're not acquiring that information ourselves, if it's leaking to the outside world, to the environment, then the quantum system will be damaged, and that's going to make our computer fail. So we have to find a way of overcoming that phenomenon of decoherence, and that's what quantum error correction is designed to do. And the principle is that we can put many qubits together in such a way that when the environment interacts with just a few qubits at a time, the information is extremely well concealed, so it doesn't easily leak to the outside world. The trouble is that to make that work effectively, we need many physical qubits to realize one very well protected logical qubit, and I think that's what the question is about. Well, it's about two things, really. Because I think the question was, how many logical qubits do we need to do something interesting? And it was at least implicit that that's much different from the number of physical qubits that we need. And it's hard to be very precise about the first question. But once we have, of order 100 qubits or a few hundred qubits, and we can do many highly accurate gates, then that takes us well beyond what we can simulate with classical computers, and we can envision applications to chemistry, for example, if our gates are sufficiently accurate, or to simulating materials that could be done with just a few hundred of these very well protected logical qubits. But then there's the question, how many physical qubits do we need for one well-protected logical qubit? And that's also a hard question to answer precisely because it depends on several things. One is, how accurate is our hardware? If the hardware is so pathetically unreliable that the quantum computer is making mistakes all the time, then quantum error correction isn't going to work at all. It's not going to give us any improvement unless the hardware is good enough. And then the better the hardware gets, the less overhead cost we have to pay to make a very reliable logical qubit. But, it's likely, unless qubit technology gets much, much better than it is now, which I think eventually will happen, that, we will need potentially hundreds of thousands of physical qubits for one really well-protected logical qubit. So that's pretty discouraging.
Yeah.
From the point of view of the current state of the technology, where, we maybe will have devices with of order 100 physical qubits in the near term, but we have to make a very big leap to maybe millions of physical qubits to get into that regime where we can perform computations that are reliable and far surpass what we can do with our classical computers for applications people might care about.
Interesting. So I have a question coming in from Ernesto Eduardo Dobarganes, and he is asking, is there any implicit Moore's law equivalent for quantum computing?
Well, I don't know. Now, people have tried to make to imitate Gordon Moore and make a plot of how quantum computing has been improving over the last 10 or 20 years to spot such trends. We speak sometimes a bit jokingly, perhaps, about Shelkoff's law after Rob Shelkoff. You probably know Rob.
I know the name. I don't know him. Yeah.
He was a Caltech student who worked on superconducting devices some time back. But Rob has said that we get something like an order of magnitude improvement in the superconducting quantum devices every grad student generation over however many years that is, maybe 3 or 4. And that was true for a while, But the metric that he and others used was what we call the coherence time, how long a superconducting qubit can sit around before it gets hit by an error. And that did improve very impressively for a while. It might be slowing down now already. But that's not the only thing we care about anyway, because we really need accurate quantum gates. And the coherence time is about storage errors. You know, if we put a qubit in quantum memory and we come back an hour later, is the qubit still there intact? But even if that's true, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can do entangling quantum gates on pairs of qubits with very high accuracy. In fact, the competing technology of trapped ions, the qubits are just wonderful. The qubits are very well isolated, single atoms, and you can prepare a qubit state in an atom, and it will survive for many hours if you just leave it alone. But that's not enough for quantum computing. For quantum computing, we need to do these accurate 2-qubit gates. And the state of the art is that there's an error rate per gate under the best conditions now of about 1 in 1,000. And of course, we'd like to see that continue to improve. But it's hard. It's really hard. It's all hard. Building a quantum computer is really challenging.
That's my next question. That comes from someone named Brian Keating, which is that, most of the applications that we have in our laboratory require, I always joke, people come to San Diego for the weather, but in the case of our quantum computer, capable laboratory that uses these Josephson junctions and squid amplifiers, we are the coldest part of, San Diego, to my knowledge, although some of my physics colleagues can go a little bit cooler, but we get down to 6 millikelvin, 6/1000ths of a degree above absolute zero. These are, incomprehensible temperatures, and we're finally getting some macroscopic, cooling powers of order microwatts, and abilities to remove heats of joules, kind of a day time scale. But, what are kind of the limits on practical quantum computers? I know you're a theoretician, but you have a lot of contact with the experimental community, and obviously you advise many of these people that are attempting to overcome current limits. Is it going to take developments in room temperature superconductivity to have practical quantum computers that we could actually use, or is it are we basically just going to have a couple of quantum computers around the world and they'll do everything for the entire planet's computing needs?
Well, first of all, it's important that there are a lot of different approaches to the technology which are advancing in parallel, because we really don't know at present which technology has the best long-term prospects for scalability to large devices that can solve hard problems. And they all have their characteristic advantages and disadvantages. Some are cryogenic, like your detectors, and operate at 10 to 20 millikelvin in a dilution refrigerator. But that's true of the superconducting devices. It's true of some of the spin qubit technologies, where the qubit resides in a spin of a single electron. It's not true of all the technologies, or at least not to the same extent. So in the case of ion traps, they can operate at room temperature. It turns out that they're quieter, they're less noisy if they run at liquid helium temperature at about 4 Kelvin. And at least some of the ion trappers are going to go in that direction to get more reliable hardware. Another example is what people call NV centers, which is a defect in material. It could be in diamond, for example. And in that case, you can get long coherence times even at room temperature. And that might be important for some sensing technologies, for example. But your broader question is, what do we really need to advance the hardware? And there's no single answer to that. In some cases, materials advances are going to be important. That can help with the superconducting technologies and with the spin qubits. Having more accurate methods for control, particularly ones which are scalable to large systems, that's also important. Designing better qubits. Qubits, in the case of a superconducting device, there's a lot of freedom in how we fashion a qubit out of the ingredients, putting together Josephson junctions, for example, in an electrical circuit. There are a lot of ways to do that, and some of those are more resistant to noise than others. And so that's another important way to advance the technology. And the extreme case of achieving big progress through improved materials is what we call topological quantum computing, which is an idea for realizing materials that have a kind of intrinsic resistance to the errors that afflict quantum hardware. And that, in the long run, could be a breakthrough technology, but like everything else, it's very hard to achieve.
Yeah, I'm actually getting a question I was about to ask you for 20 pounds of British sterling from a friend of ours, Stefan Roche, in the UK. And he's asking, does John think that quantum materials such as topological insulators or other manifestations of entanglement in Majorana fermions or in many-body physics can offer more possibilities for information processing? From what you just said, it would seem the answer is yes, but primarily for error correction. Is that correct?
Well, that's the advantage that topological materials potentially have. It's a wonderful idea. I mean, for a theorist, it's an irresistibly beautiful idea. It came from the fertile imagination of Alexei Kitaev, my Caltech colleague. Actually, I'll tell you something funny about that, which maybe says something about me and also about Alexei. Um, so Alexei's idea was to take advantage of something called an enneon, which is a concept and a word, which Frank Wilczek is responsible for. It means particles that have interactions that we call topological. What does that word topological mean? It means, well, it's topologists talk about properties which remain unchanged when you smoothly deform an object. So, you can't smoothly change a sphere into a donut. And it's very natural to think about topology in the setting of quantum computing because we would like the way we do our quantum gates, the fundamental quantum operations, to remain invariant when we deform the hardware by introducing the noise. And Kitaev proposed this in 1997. And what's funny is that over the preceding 8 or so years, I had been very interested in enneons, and in particular what we call non-abelian enneons, which are the ones which are promising from the point of view of quantum information processing. And then I got very interested in quantum error correction, how we can make quantum computers robust in the presence of noise. And somehow I didn't appreciate that these two ideas are extremely closely related. That, in fact, enneons can provide an approach to doing quantum error correction, which has some characteristic advantages. Kitaev did realize that. And when I first heard about the idea during his first visit to Caltech in 1997, I was immediately excited because I was perfectly prepared to appreciate the idea and how brilliant it was, but I hadn't thought of it myself. And so that tells you something about me, and it tells you something about Kitaev, but I guess it also illustrates the principle, which is often applicable, that things that seem obvious in retrospect are not necessarily obvious at the time of their discovery. And so that was one of the things I missed. And it was just, I think, a manifestation of my own limitations.
Yes, well, we all have blind spots in our education, but yours are very much more narrow than most of us mortals. But so, getting a couple more questions, but I do want to remind folks that we are raising funds for an extremely worthy cause, close to my heart, close to John's heart, and that's the Foothill Unity Center, which is located in Pasadena. Let me see if I can get that up on the screen here. There we go, Foothill Unity Center. There we go. Very worthy charity with many great beneficiaries and doing just a tremendous amount of good in my former hometown when I was at that technical college known as Caltech. Please get involved. Donate in the super chat and I will double it. We've already gotten a tremendous number of donations. Thank you so much, but we can always use more so they can do more. And it's a very, very important project for 2021. So help us do good. My audience is the best in the known multiverse. We're going to turn to cosmology in a second. I do want to ask folks to please subscribe to this channel. Exercise your fingers regularly. Real doctors will tell you to do that. Push the subscribe button, push the notification bell, hit the thumbs up button, and that will make folks happy. If you're listening to this on iTunes, please leave a review and a rating because that helps us get great guests like John. You know, he looks at my ratings and reviews and he decided he would come on finally because of the erudition, the perspicacity of this amazing fan base. And you could tell, John, from the questions we're getting, this is no ordinary YouTube unboxing channel. We're going to unbox a quantum computer next time you come on the show. I want to turn towards cosmology. We've had on folks like Frank Wilczek. We've had on Roger Penrose. We've had on Leonard Mlodinow, and also his friend Deepak Chopra. Actually had a conversation live, the four of us, Deepak Chopra, myself, Frank Wilczek, and Leonard Mlodinow, and we talked a lot about theories of everything, about the essence of singularities, etc. The first thing, before we take a deep dive into cosmology, I want to first start with a bet that you made with Stephen Hawking, which, according to Leonard's book on his friendship with Stephen Hawking, he says a bunch of things, but he remarks specifically about you that nowadays your whole third quarter course at Caltech for graduate students in general relativity, when you teach it, is just dedicated to Hawking radiation. So is that true or is that false?
Well, it was once true. I haven't taught that course for a while. In fact, I first taught it, I don't know. I don't think Leonard was around at the time. But I guess he heard about it. I first taught it in the early 90s. And actually, I was encouraged to do that by Kip Thorne, who thought it would be a natural way of capping our three-term general relativity sequence to devote to the third term after they've already learned the principles of general relativity and about properties of black holes to the quantum field theory on curved space-time, which is relevant for understanding Hawking radiation. Now, this was, as is often the case, very educational for me, because although I had some working knowledge of the topic, you know, when you teach a class, you just get a much deeper understanding. And so I worked really hard on that class, and I did teach it a couple more times. And the goal was to start with no prior knowledge of quantum field theory, but the students were in the third term of a general relativity sequence, so they all knew something about general relativity, although for this course you didn't need to know that much about that either, except some appreciation for what a black hole is, and to, starting from nothing, more or less, arrive at an explanation for why black holes emit Hawking radiation. So that was a lot of fun, and it deepened my understanding of that subject, and it also got me more deeply involved in my own research in thinking about the quantum behavior of black holes. And as has often been the case for me, and I'm sure others, the store of knowledge I collected in the process of teaching that material is something I've often drawn on in my own research in the following years.
So I actually have a bet from theory.caltech.edu, and that is, whereas Stephen Hawking and Kip Thorne firmly believe that quantum information that information swallowed by a black hole is forever hidden from the outside universe and can never be revealed even as the black hole evaporates and completely disappears. And whereas John Preskill firmly believes that a mechanism for the information to be released by the evaporating black hole must and will be found in the correct theory of quantum gravity. Therefore, Preskill offers and Hawking accepts a wager that when an initial pure quantum state undergoes gravitational collapse to form a black hole, the final state at the end of the black hole evaporation will be a pure quantum state. And the winners will play an encyclopedia of the winner's choice. And this is witnessed Kip Thorne, John Preskill, Stephen Hawking, 6th of February, 1997. So now you won that bet, but I want to push back just gently and always with respect. And I brought this up to Roger Penrose, even himself, and I want to bring it up with you. I always hear the following. We need a theory of quantum gravity because at the singularity of a black hole's core, the laws of general relativity must break down, and the singularity must therefore be a reflection of the fact that some other physics is needed. That's one instantiation of the notion of a singularity. The other one being the initial singularity that was believed by Hawking and Penrose to be the initiation point of our current observable universe. I point out the following, Gedanken experiment. What if you get a letter from the old one, as Einstein used to call it? Here come my finger puppets, my voodoo dolls. Here we go. I got one of you, but it's on order. It's got too many pins in it. But let's say the old one, as Einstein called God, tells you, well, the Big Bang might not have happened as Sir Roger, newly minted Nobel laureate, who left his Nobel Prize in my office foolishly. But it may not have happened. It may be conformal cyclic cosmology all the way down. Furthermore, we have no ability to access the singularity of a black hole and no way to get the information out, even if we could access it. So what if there are no singularities? Would you still say we need a theory of quantum gravity?
I would say whether you need it, I couldn't say, Brian. But we want to understand what happens inside a black hole. It may seem rather exotic. Well, it is rather exotic, let's face it. To consider experiments in which we enter a black hole and see what happens to us. And I think part of the point you're making is that if we stay outside the black hole, we won't have, at least not in any obvious way, direct access to the outcome of an experiment that occurred inside. But, for all we know, we're inside a black hole now, Brian. It might be a really, really big one, and we're tumbling towards the singularity, and that would, focus our attention more on wanting to understand what happens in the late stages of gravitational collapse. Whether you want to call it quantum gravity or not, that's just words. You just want to understand how it works. Now, as far as early universe cosmology is concerned, I'm a little surprised hearing this from you because what I hope you will succeed in doing someday is finding evidence for primordial gravitational radiation from very early in the history of the universe. And that will, of course, be a real milestone in physics. And we hope it will illuminate our understanding of very early universe cosmology. And that in itself is really quantum gravity in a way, because we're talking about gravitational waves that were produced by quantum fluctuations in the very early universe. At least that's our current understanding of the explanation of the signal that you've been looking for. That's quantum gravity.
Yeah.
And we hope that'll give us some insight into the, so to speak, initial singularity.
So I'm glad you said that. It gives me an opportunity to tease you just gently again with respect that the namesake for which your chaired professorship is named is, of course, Richard Feynman, who said the first principle is that you should not fool yourself. No one ever says the second principle, but I think it's you're the easiest person to fool, to which I added a third one, John. You'll be interested to know. I'm unveiling it here for the first time. The third principle is that you must never fool Richard Feynman. Because that would just be mean to fool Richard. First of all, did you know him well? Did you guys overlap much at all?
We overlapped for 5 years on the Caltech faculty. I arrived in 1983, and Feynman passed away in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And we did interact. We had a shared interest in quantum chromodynamics, the theory of the strong interaction, and in particular, its so-called non-perturbative aspects. That is, the things that we can understand, ironically enough, just using Feynman diagrams. How do we explain things like quark confinement, for example? Feynman was very interested in that. So was I. We often discussed those issues. I just, as an aside, my first encounter with Feynman was not a face-to-face encounter. It occurred when I was 9 years old, and I acquired a book which was called The World of Science. This was a big golden book about science, and there was a chapter called Theoretical Physics. I was a fourth grader. I got this book at a book fair, and I read the whole book. It was fascinating in many ways, but the thing that resonated with me the most at the time was the chapter on theoretical physics, which discussed the discovery that parity is violated, that physics in a mirror is different than physics in real life. And that was I just found that totally amazing. And in this chapter, incidentally, there was also a story about a little boy who had a ball in a wagon, and he asked his father why the ball goes to the back of the wagon when he starts pulling it, and it goes to the front of the wagon when he stops pulling it. And his father told him, well, that's called inertia, but nobody knows why. And then years later, when Feynman did the BBC interview with Christopher Sykes, he told that story. And I thought, what's going on here? Feynman stole that story from that little golden book. Well, it wasn't a big golden book that I read when I was 9 years old. But I still have the book, so I looked back and I saw that, in fact, all the chapters, the author of the book was named Jane Werner Watson, and she had gotten every chapter from interviews with Caltech faculty. You wouldn't have known this unless you looked at the very fine print in the notes. So, of course, she had based that chapter on conversations with Feynman and Gell-Mann, who the book was just really rather amazing. The book was published in 1958. Parity violation had just been discovered 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
That was the year that Feynman and Gell-Mann collaborated on a famous paper about the theory of the weak interaction that accounted for parity violation, and that got into this golden book about science. And it actually was described very cogently what the experimental evidence was for the violation of parity. And so that really did have an influence on me, I think, that I encountered that book at that age.
Wow.
But anyway, Feynman, at the time that I was at Caltech, he was getting very interested in quantum computing, and I can tell you why. It was because of our shared interest in quantum chromodynamics and his recognition that with the methods that were then just starting out for studying QCD using classical computers, which are what we call Monte Carlo methods, that they had limitations. And there were some problems you just wouldn't be able to solve using that type of technology, that type of algorithm. He also thought it was going to be a long time before we'd have accurate data from those simulations, and he was right about that too. But this was part of what stimulated him to think about the idea of a quantum computer, because he appreciated that it would be too hard to simulate something like a collision between two protons at very high energy, to understand from first principles in QCD, for which we know the right equations, but they're just too hard to solve, what comes out when you bang two protons together. And that, I think, was a key feature in guiding him towards proposing the idea of a quantum computer to solve problems that would be too hard to solve otherwise.
When I think about that, his prescience in all things, in gravity and nanotechnology, his famous Plenty of Room at the Bottom lecture, but also that kind of principle against confirmation bias and the notion of you're the easiest person to fool, and that scientists often give off this aura of invincibility, which I think, I had this conversation with Caltech postdoc alum Jim Gates, who I know you know very well. He's a good friend of mine, and a mentor to me and millions of other people. And Jim was saying, look, there's this notion that Einstein is some unapproachable genius, and he's like, Einstein wasn't always Einstein, and but I feel like Feynman might have always been Feynman. He had this kind of otherworldly, almost magical ability to both communicate science, but also to develop and innovate in science in a very artistic, showman-like way. And the only reason I bring up that famous quote against confirmation bias is because you said, I hope that you'll be successful in discovering it. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about that and how it, of course, led to the famous episode in my book, Behind Me Losing the Nobel Prize, which you can get wherever books are sold. I'm waiting for John's book to come out so I can also hawk his book when that does appear in quantum computing. But the point being that, oftentimes you see what you want to see, and as Feynman was saying, that scientists have this extra special duty because the layperson sees us as these very special people doing very special things with very special equipment, and that maybe they don't have access to it, but they're certainly interested in it. But, I'm not sure I could ask somebody like Richard Feynman this question, but it's just amazing to hear the story of you as a 9-year-old, this through line carrying through to the little boy becoming the Feynman professor at Caltech. It's just astounding to me, the serendipity of it all. And I think that is, kind of a basis for a lot of good science is that you see where your curiosity takes you. But getting back to this notion of quantum matter and quark matter, et cetera. So I asked this of Frank Wilczek earlier this week. I would like to get your impression. I said, to me, one of the most beautiful experiments ever done is the Aharonov-Bohm effect, because it really does this magical kind of connection between the classical world and the quantum world, and it also connects things that we thought had no physical import, namely the vector potential, and it makes it manifest in an actual classical physical experiment, which again can be manifest on quantum scales too. That, to me, is one of the most beautiful experiments. The C.S. Wu, Madame Wu experiment that revealed parity violation that you just talked about as a young child that you read about. What to you, I'll tell you what Frank said, but I want to know, what, John, is your most beautiful experiment coming from the perspective of a renowned theorist? What makes an experiment beautiful, and what experiments do you particularly find important and beautiful?
Well, just to follow up on the Aharonov-Bohm example, which is, of course, a wonderful example, one of the things that I think is really cool about that is that you can observe the Aharonov-Bohm effect in a solid-state device in which an electron follows one of two paths, even though it's kind of dirty. And the electron gets scattered in the device because of the dirt. But because it gets scattered elastically, because by being scattered it doesn't leave any footprints in the material, there's no record of which way it went. And so you have to consider the quantum mechanical superposition of two paths, even though that electron was not perfectly isolated from other stuff. It was getting bumped around, but in getting bumped around, it didn't leave any record, and therefore that quantum mechanical interference was possible. I'm not sure what I think is the most beautiful experiment, but I already made reference to the fact, which I think is quite amazing, that we can manipulate single atoms now with extraordinary precision, thanks to laser technology.
Yeah.
So it's often the case that in order to make scientific progress, we need new ideas, but we also need new technology. Mm-hmm. And in order to do the things that people do nowadays, manipulating single atoms or interactions between pairs of atoms with laser light, for example, it requires very sophisticated laser technology. You need very quiet, stable lasers to do that. And it's just a single atom, for Christ's sake. And yet, you can make it very, very palpable. You can make it do what you want it to do because we have the technology for that. I think that if you step back and think about it, is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I want to segue into something related to what Frank answered, which was the not physically beautiful necessarily, but the fact that QCD can be revealed, or asymptotic freedom, et cetera, can be revealed by these quark jets that come out that reveal the internal composition of the structure of the nucleon, which I think is which is quite amazing. I want to take a break, and then I'm going to come right back to that. I don't know how much more time do you have today, John?
Well, I'm still having fun.
Yeah, me too. So, I want to keep going if we can. So the question that I have, well, first let me just take a break. Please like and subscribe and comment, etc., on this video, on this podcast on iTunes. It really helps us in our mission to connect the multiverse of minds around these very high-level, deep conversations that hopefully are accessible to people too. So exercise your finger regularly, push the like, push the subscribe, give a rating, etc. Also, please note, I am taking all your donations. My friend and moderator, Jacob Kuhn, who's just a hilarious and helpful sprite who's doing such a good job. He's keeping track of every donation. I am going to double it. It's going to the Foothill Center in Pasadena, which is a cause near and dear to my heart and to John's as well. So please keep the super chats coming. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. And we'll hopefully raise a lot of great resources for this wonderful charity. So, and that can be held.
Can I follow up on what you were saying about jets and QCD? Because there's a Feynman story here too, right?
Yeah.
Which goes back to about 1968, when there were these mysterious scaling results seen in the SLAC electroproduction experiments, and trying to figure out what was going on, Feynman developed what he called the parton model. It infuriated Murray Gell-Mann, by the way, that he called them partons instead of quarks. But at any rate, he anticipated that in a high-energy collision of protons, if you hit a quark, he called it a parton, if you hit it really hard, you could produce a pair of leading quarks going in opposite directions, which, although you wouldn't be able to detect the single quark, would produce a spray of strongly interacting particles, which could be detected. Now, this was actually an absurd idea, because there are very strong interactions inside the proton, and the quarks can't get out, and he was pretending they were just like free particles. There were some people who ridiculed the idea for that example. I might as well name names. Murray Gell-Mann thought it was, amazingly unsophisticated to treat those quarks as though they were free particles, whereas obviously they couldn't be because they were trapped inside the proton. And yet, as experiments validated, the picture is pretty accurate. Now, of course, the reason the picture makes sense is because of asymptotic freedom. In 1968 or 9, Feynman didn't know that, but nevertheless, he had the boldness and intuition to propose that for some purposes, the things rattling around inside a proton would behave like they were nearly free. And of course, later on, we understood the theoretical foundation of that picture.
That's right. I'm getting a quote from one of my good friends and very devoted followers, Brett Harris, who makes a joke that those were, of course, Feynman, being the womanizer he was, named those after Dolly Parton. So the next comment I want to make about relevant to jets and Frank Wilczek's statement that that's the most beautiful experiment to him. Of course, he had to also associate it with his Gildan medallion that he achieved as well. But to me, I want to connect it to something which is tangentially perhaps related to quantum computing. And I know you're going to get mad at me, but I have to say it, the simulation hypothesis. So there is this notion that quantum computing will become so powerful It will be way beyond supremacy, and it'll be something that we can hardly envision today, just as, Einstein could not have envisioned an iPhone, and us having this conversation essentially at the speed of light, taking questions from Pakistan and Uganda at the same time as La Jolla and Pasadena. But the concept of the simulation hypothesis is, as Nick Bostrom and others have popularized it, that eventually we'll reach this incredible power of AI. And so it might even have occurred already. And that you and I, as you said before, we might be inside a black hole's event horizon now, plummeting furiously towards the singularity, but in the notion that we would be unaware of it. And so in that same sense, as Descartes would say, we could be brains in jars, we could be brains in a computer, and a quantum computer. So first, I want to ask you, what do you think about this simulation hypothesis? Do you put any stock in it? And then if you're willing to, I'd love to talk about some of the implications, the moral and ethical implications of artificial intelligence, if such a scenario is at all plausible in John Preskill's mind.
Well, I have limited interest in it unless we can somehow validate it. If we had a way of doing an experiment which would yield a result that would say, aha, we are in a simulation or we are not, that would certainly be interesting. And there have been some suggestions along those lines, although rather crude ones. When we tried to simulate an imaginary world on our computers, we can't do it perfectly. So, for example, if I wanted to, people do it. If you wanted to simulate quantum chromodynamics, it's a quantum field theory, and that means you have an infinite number of degrees of freedom per unit volume, and you can never put that on a computer. So you approximate it, and you approximate it by just introducing some lattice in space, or doing some other what we call regularization, some truncation of the problem, and that means that the results don't exactly agree with the target that we're trying to simulate. So if our hypothetical higher beings who might be simulating our world have similar limitations, if we could somehow find evidence for the imperfections in their simulations, I'm not sure how, but that would be interesting. So in fact, you can, people have tried to get limits on the possibility that space isn't a continuum, but is really an approximation, some kind of lattice structure. How can we probe that in an experiment? Well, that's somewhat interesting to think about.
Yeah, I'm showing.
But if it's purely hypothetical and then we don't have a way of testing it, then I just can't get that interesting.
Yeah, I'm showing on the screen now a paper by Silas Bean, Zohre Davoudi, and Martin Savage called Constraints on the Universe as a Numerical Simulation. And they're examining these consequences of a cubic spacetime lattice or grid being explored in the QCD lattice simulations. So using historical development of lattice gauge theory technology as a guide, we assume our universe is an early numerical simulation with unimproved Wilson fermion discretization. I don't know what that means, but we investigate potentially observable consequences. Among the observables that are considered is G-2 and the spectrum of cosmic rays, and so forth. So there are, forays into it. I wonder always, how fruitful this will be. But eventually, I think, this can be, a manifestation of perhaps deeper questions, maybe that go outside of science, even into perhaps religion. Because if you think about the universe as a simulation, maybe there are simulators, maybe there's artificial life out there, as Max Tegmark calls it, as life 3.0. And then my question is, what obligation do we humans have to these artificial intelligence? Can we turn them off? Can we blow up one of their capacitors? So I want to turn to artificial intelligence for a little bit, and ask about the prospects for improvements in AI. And also, you've talked about this before. I always say it's not so surprising to me that computers can beat humans at chess. Even the AlphaZero results, where it basically learns the rules of chess from millions and trillions of games played by humans and then playing itself, and even learn the pieces and how they move, and that a knight moves a different way than a bishop. But what would really surprise me and convince me that computers have artificial wisdom is if they could create the game of chess itself. Or, if there's a lot of art now that I'm told exists on the blockchain. There's actually blockchain art that exists that you can buy it and it exists, and you get it on a USB key if you want it. 50 megabytes worth of beautiful computer created art. I want to ask you, these notions of artificial intelligence. When do you think a computer can ever create a game like chess, or even chess itself? And then I want to ask you a follow up about the laws of physics. Can an artificial intelligence eventually, just given the laws of Newton, derive the laws of Einstein? But first, tell me, what are your thoughts about artificial intelligence and its future and the limitations possibly thereof?
Well, I don't see any reason why not. In answer to your question, can artificial intelligence be creative? Can it discover things that have escaped the astute humans? That seems likely to me as artificial intelligence continues to advance. And part of the reason I say that is I think you and I are ourselves just sophisticated machines. I don't believe that there is magic in human cognition. I think it's a kind of emergent phenomenon that occurs in a sufficiently complicated network of neurons. And if it can happen in our brains, I don't see why it can't happen in devices that engineers build.
And
sorry, what was that rest of the question?
Well, can a computer, create the game of chess, or a game that...
What I'd like to see them do is be funny. Why can't they create a great sitcom?
That's art for that we all would need right now. I think, as much of a joke as I am, but it still would be great to have comic relief.
People have fooled around getting AI systems to create visual art and to write poetry, and so far I'm not really impressed, but that'll get better and better.
So again, we're talking with John Preskill, a Feynman Professor of Physics, California Institute of Technology, Caltech, Go Beavers. Spent many wonderful lectures listening to John, both up at Caltech and here at UC San Diego, where he's given some of our prize lectures. Sticking on the theme of artificial intelligence, as you know, my friend Max Tegmark has done a lot of work in this. He's a guest on the show, frequent guest on the show, and that reminds me to ask you all out there to please subscribe, because Max is coming back again on the Into the Impossible podcast. But he talks about creating artificial physicists, and my question to you is, let's say now I've got my voodoo doll out. This is Galileo. So Galileo did something, and then Newton came along and did something even better. But there's something different in my mind between what Newton did to Galileo and his laws of motion and what Einstein did. It's a fundamentally different characteristic class. So I can almost imagine a computer programmed with the laws of Newtonian physics or the laws of Galilean relativity coming up with Newtonian mechanics. But it's harder for me to think about a computer coming up just with the lacuna in the data that general relativity patched up, the perihelion anomaly of Mercury, etc., that a computer could come up with GR as an artificial physicist. What do you think about this? Because I have some desires in pedagogy that I want to talk to you about right after this. But tell me, what are your thoughts about the nature of physics? Is it like coming up with good stand-up, comedy, or is it something that that computers couldn't do?
Where do you get those Einstein and Galileo?
I'm going to send you one.
You
Don't worry. Yes, I have a team of little servants at home that are I buy them from a place called the Unemployed Philosophers Guild. They're called magnetic personnel. I've got one of everyone. I got Carl Sagan here. I've got Noam Chomsky, who's also been a guest on the show. I've got Kurt Gödel, who has not been a guest on the show. That would be quite a get. I will send you some, John. I'll send you an Einstein, and we got to get one of Feynman and one of you. But can't
those really come in handy, don't they?
Good pun. Good pun, John. Come in handy. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you mentioned Gödel, because he's sort of relevant to your question, perhaps. The notion that there's a distinction to be made between things that we can easily verify through thought or computation, and the things that we can discover, what the computer scientists call the conjecture that P is not equal to NP. Gödel thought about this quite some time ago, like in the 1950s. And he was very curious about what it would mean if P is equal to NP. That would mean that anything that you could, by some feasible computation, check would be something that you could discover. And he found this idea rather distressing because it indicated to him that there was no role for the creativity of the mathematician who somehow, by some mysterious process, was able to discover a theorem for which a proof could be given, and it was possible for any diligent party to check that the proof was correct. But to come up with the theorem in the first place required a leap of creativity. And so, some might believe, and did you discuss this with Roger? Because he has interesting views on this kind of thing. Roger Penrose.
Yeah, we certainly did, and I talked about it with Noam Chomsky as well. This notion of kind of incompleteness, and I feel there's an old joke that most sciences have physics envy, but I actually think physicists have mathematician envy in a sense that we don't have a law that tells us whether or not something is physics. I mean, most of us use Popper. I think I have a Popper doll somewhere, but your friend Lenny Susskind, said, don't be overwhelmed by the paparazzi. Basically these unfalsifiable, kind of cudgels that physicists get hit with are not as useful as Gödel's incompleteness theorem is to mathematics. So I joke that, we have mathematician envy in a sense. And I think Roger, to some extent, agrees.
Well, anyway, to come back to your question, it's my belief that the leap that, say, an Einstein made by discovering general relativity on the basis of rather paltry experimental evidence at the time is something that an artificial intelligence system should eventually be able to do, because I don't think Einstein or other human physicists and mathematicians are superhuman. I think they're machines too. So I think they're just very sophisticated and effective machines. Now, incidentally, the discovery of general relativity was not something that sprung from Einstein's mind in its full glory instantaneously. It was the result of a struggle that went on for years and in which there were many wrong turns.
Yeah.
But, he was able, just on theoretical grounds, to find the way, because of various things that he tried seemed not to work. So the circumstances were such that it was possible to find one's way to that discovery through, of course, enormous creative genius, but also a kind of process of trial and error until he hit on the right thing.
Yeah, it is kind of, and wasn't ever. It took 5 years to come up with the final formulation, and then even in its final formulation, he had the cosmological term, which he apocryphally called a blunder, but he really didn't. But still, it was a blunder to even think it was a blunder, because of course in 97, 98, we realized we needed dark energy or some cosmological like acceleration to explain the anomalous acceleration of expansion of the universe that former guest Adam Rees talked about on the show earlier this summer. It's funny because I get a lot of emails, I'm sure you do too. I'm actually getting some right now that say, Professor Keating, Einstein was wrong. I can prove it. I'm not so good at math, but if you help me, I will share the Nobel Prize with you. At least a third of the Nobel Prize. I'll share that with you, but you got to help me do it. But he was wrong. And I told that to Adam Rees, and he said, yeah, how do you think I won my Nobel Prize?
Oh, yeah. Well, Einstein did make blunders. And in the case of the cosmological constant, I mean, I've always felt that the blunder was not that he proposed it, which was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's a perfectly sensible thing to add to the equations. In fact, from our modern point of view, it's very hard to understand why it wouldn't be there, or even why it would be as small as it's observed to be. The blunder was that his motivation for doing so was to make the universe static.
Yes.
And it's unstable.
Yes.
And he never bothered to check. I mean, at least it's not mentioned in his paper that he was balancing the universe like a pencil on its point, and it wouldn't, you give it a little nudge and it would not stay static.
Yeah. So Mario Livio, who you may know, has written many, many books. The Golden Ratio. He's got a mathematician, I think, or maybe someone else wrote that. But he wrote a book recently, Brilliant Blunders, and also a book about creativity. We talk about, even Darwin had blunders. Galileo certainly had some huge whoppers. He missed the discovery of the planet Neptune. He thought the Earth's tides. I don't know if you've ever seen this book or read this book, John. I had not read it until very recently. This is a book that is called The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. And there's a foreword by Stephen Jay Gould and so forth. And there's a foreword by Albert Einstein, who calls it one of the greatest books in science history. Much better than even Newton's Principia, which is almost unreadable even for a layperson, but certainly even for a physicist, certainly for many lay people. But in that book, the original title for the book called The Dialogue was, I don't know if do you know what the original title that Galileo wanted for this book?
I do not.
It was On the Flux and Reflux of Tides in Oceans, Rivers, and Ferns. I don't know what a fern is. Maybe you do, but
that was really burying the lead, wasn't it?
But actually, that was what he thought was the most pronounced evidence for the Copernican theory. And of course, it's totally wrong. The tides are caused by the Earth's moon, not the Earth's motion. And so the Catholic Church did him a favor. They prohibited him to use that title. Maybe they thought the evidence was overwhelming, but it really goes to show, great men and great women are capable of making great mistakes. I wonder, we have this image of Richard Feynman as ineffable, as unfailing, as, prescient beyond human mortal comprehension. Is there a blunder that he made? I have 8 different blunders that Einstein made, ranging from, spooky action at a distance to the cosmological constant. Even his original paper on relativity contained a misassociation of energy and mass. I mean, he went on to have an okay career. Okay, I'm not really gonna assail him too much. But did Feynman have any blunders? I'm not particularly aware of it. He didn't get credit for things like quarks, but that was not a blunder per se. Do you know of any mistakes or whoppers that he might have made?
Not in his publications that come to mind. Mm-hmm. He was fallible, and I think he was certainly capable of being wrong in physics discussions that I recall. Now I should add the qualifier that I started to have scientific discussions with Feynman when he was, in his 60s, mm-hmm. and the Feynman of earlier decades might have given a different impression. But he would sometimes surprise me. Because he had some ideas about renormalization, for example, that I thought were a little behind the times and unsophisticated. Feynman often said, or would give the advice that, don't pay attention to what other people say, mm-hmm. Put their papers away and work it out for yourself. And there's something to be said for that, of course. When you really work it out, you own it. But it's not very good advice. It's bad advice. It wouldn't be very good advice for me, and it's not very good advice for most students because, the people who worked on problems ahead of you were not all idiots, and you can learn a lot by studying their work. Of course, you want to be able to internalize it to the extent that you can reproduce it. And I think Feynman, in the years that I knew him, suffered a bit from his attitude that, he wasn't so interested in what others working on similar problems had to say. As I mentioned earlier, we worked well, we discussed, we never wrote a paper or anything, but we used to discuss quark confinement and how to think about it. And there were very insightful papers on the topic by, for example, Polyakov and Tuft, two of my physics heroes, and which Feynman. In discussions, he thought I was brilliant because I was able to share the insights I had learned by reading those papers. But he would have benefited if he had been more open to following the literature at that stage.
Yeah, and he could have had a good career. I want to take a couple questions from the audience. If you'll indulge me on this. This is a very technical question. Again, I have a brilliant audience of fellow geeks, nerds, and dweebs all around the world. And this one is going to come from another one from Brett Harris. This is in Aussie dollars, which I think are miniature dollars. I'm not sure. But Brett asks, loop quantum gravity implies the horizon of a black hole contains the information in area eigenstates. Could there be literally nothing inside the event horizon, including the absence of space-time itself?
It's a very interesting question, and it has been a topic of some controversy in recent years. I think, you asked about the singularity earlier, and it's true we don't have anything close to a satisfying theoretical understanding of what happens at the singularity inside a black hole. The horizon itself is also very interesting from the point of view of quantum gravity. And in fact, you mentioned the bet earlier that I had with Stephen about what happens to information.
That's right.
That falls into a black hole. And his intuition that a black hole would destroy information was not, and the singularity had something to do with it, but one could understand where he was coming from just thinking about the event horizon, that stuff would fall into a black hole and it didn't have any way of getting out. And he had discovered, now that wouldn't itself necessarily mean that information gets destroyed were it not for the fact of Hawking radiation, which he discovered, which means that a black hole radiates away its mass and eventually could disappear entirely. So if you throw some precious information encoded in your diary or something like that into a black hole, then if that black hole evaporates and disappears, it seems that that information is from then on permanently concealed from any possible observer. And it was that kind of picture that led to him to argue that information is lost. Our current understanding, and I would not claim that we have at all a complete understanding of how it works, is that the information encoded in that diary does get revealed by the Hawking radiation itself, but in a very, very highly scrambled form, which is hard to read. And in order to understand how that works, we don't necessarily have to contemplate what happens at the singularity. And in fact, that's part of the reason that addressing the question of information lost by black holes hasn't taught us much about the singularity.
Right.
But I think we have gotten a lot of insight into how information can leak out of a black hole by understanding more deeply what's happening in the vicinity of the event horizon.
So just to, I've taken on a new component of the Into the Impossible podcast. Again, everybody stretch your fingers. It's been a nice long 94 minutes so far. We're going to keep going for a few more minutes until I get overwhelmed with hunger and start to eat one of these finger puppets on my desk. But please do subscribe, like, and leave a comment what you're learning from this episode. And hopefully we can get John back for a part 2 someday. But on one of my components of the Into the Impossible podcast, I ask authors if they're willing to do the following: to read the highest and lowest reviews that they've gotten on their book or project on Amazon. And a lot of people like to do that. Some people are scared to do that. They don't want to hear the 1-star reviews, and so yeah, I sometimes will not press the issue. Since your book is not out yet, when is your book on quantum computing coming out, John?
I don't know. I have infinitely patient editors at Cambridge University Press.
Well, whenever it comes out. I'm sorry for delaying it for almost 2 hours now, but we'll continue. But anyway, getting to this, the Erdos apparently said he was incredibly productive, but once his students got very concerned because he was basically doing amphetamines every day, he would take some form of caffeine and amphetamines. And they implored him. They said, "You have to stop. You're addicted." And he said, "I'm not addicted. I can stop anytime." He stopped, and they said, "Stop for a month." So he stopped for a month. At the end of the month, he came back, and he said, "You have congratulations. I've done it, but you have set mathematics back exactly 1 month." So this conversation is setting back quantum computing textbooks exactly 2 hours, hopefully. But I want to push back from a colleague by the name of Sabine Hassenfelder. I don't know if you know Sabina, but she claims the black hole information loss paradox is one of the biggest hyped problems and a waste of time in all of physics. It's been solved multiple times. It's not been solved. It can't be solved because existing technology, she says, I'm reading from some of her tweets, because the Hawking temperature of the known black holes is too low to see them evaporating. And even if we did see them evaporating, it wouldn't tell us anything about information loss. So how do you respond to that, given that, a lot of this kind of notoriety, at least that Hawking got, was based on, in part, this bet that the two of you wagered together?
Well, I think Sabina is too pessimistic. I mean, I understand where she's coming from, I think. Physics advances by the interplay of theory and experiment, and she's expressing the concern that we're speculating about phenomena that we don't have a means of exploring experimentally. And so we're limited, we're constrained to try to attack the problem just by pure thought, and she just doesn't believe we can make progress that way.
Yeah.
I think we actually have made a lot of progress, and in fact, I'm hopeful that we can accelerate that progress eventually, coming back to the topic at the beginning of this discussion, by simulating phenomena like the formation and evaporation of a black hole using quantum computers. And we understand, I think, and this is one of the signals of progress in recent years, what that would mean, how we would do it. And the what has been the foundation of much of our progress on understanding quantum gravity for over 20 years is what we call holographic duality. One of your earlier guests, actually, did you have Juan Maldacena on your show?
Yes, I did, and Lenny Susskind, which I'll get to in a
So
second.
you had Lenny and Juan, and Lenny and Tuft really conceived the holographic principle, and Juan discovered in 1997 a manifestation of it, which we've continued to pursue and think about, and I think it's led to quite remarkable insights, and it concerns the importance of quantum entanglement. In fact, what this holographic duality is about, in the form that that Maldacena formulated, is that we can, in a particular type of space-time, which unfortunately isn't the one we live in, so it's kind of a current model, anti-de Sitter space, we can explore gravitational phenomena in which quantum effects are important by using ordinary quantum mechanics, describing behavior at the boundary of that space-time, in fact, a space of one lower dimension. And so somehow this bulk evolution of geometry is encoded in that boundary. And how is it encoded? It's encoded in the structure of the quantum entanglement in that boundary description. So we have these two different ways of describing the same physical phenomena. They look very different, but there's a dictionary that relates the description in one formulation with the description on the other, and that's very empowering, because you can make use of that dictionary to get insights which would otherwise be very elusive. And what we are learning from that is that we should think of the geometry of space itself in the context of quantum gravity as a kind of emergent phenomenon. It's really a manifestation of quantum entanglement, in a sense, which we partially understand. And what we haven't understood very well so far is how to think about what happens to Brian Keating when he daringly enters a black hole and crosses the event horizon, and what he experiences in the black hole interior. We still have a limited understanding of that, and in particular of what happens at the singularity, as we discussed earlier. But I think really amazing insights are occurring. And when it comes to experiment, since we now understand that in a way this quantum gravity can be described by ordinary quantum mechanics, that's something we can simulate with quantum computers. And I'm hopeful, although it's not going to happen in the next 10 years, in a few decades, I'm hopeful that we'll get real insights into quantum gravity by doing such experiments. And we wouldn't have thought of doing those experiments if we had followed Sabina's instructions to not bother to think about it, because we'll never figure it out.
Yeah, I had that discussion with Lenny exactly about this very topic, and it surprised me. I mean, I asked him, what is the most, quantum aspect of a black hole in totality? Is it the singularity? And he said, no, it's the stretched horizon that he sort of, I believe, coined the term about, and that how much we're learning about quantum gravity and the potential for quantum gravity from it. Of course, that dovetailed in nicely with the conversation I had with Kamran Vafa as well, that essentially that we're learning more and more about concepts like quantum gravity, like even string theory, from potentially from observations of black holes, even with your colleagues at Caltech and LIGO instrumentation. I've had Ray Weiss on and Barry Barish, and they think there might be clues that we could get to the quantum nature of black holes, even from instruments, maybe successors to LIGO, if not LIGO itself. So I think, and there are people working on current generation gravitational wave instrumentation to detect quantum properties of black holes. So
let me put in a word for my friend Kip Thorne. Have you tried to have Kip on your show?
Yes, Kip is amazing. He's blown me off 3 times, but always as a gentleman, and he has a great reason for it, which I'll summarize by just saying he's never been so productive, he claims, during COVID, and that the COVID emergency, which is tragic and awful, has afforded him the opportunity to say no to schmendricks like me. So he's declining everything. I guess he and Ray and Barry are working on a book about LIGO. So he's occupied by that.
Well, I was just going to say the notion of a stretched horizon as sort of a living, breathing thing. This was Kip's idea.
Oh, wow.
That he developed with his students. I guess in the 1980s, they wrote a book about it, in fact. But they were thinking about black holes as classical objects for the most part, although they had some ideas about their quantum behavior as well, and pointed out, you can think of the horizon as having physical properties like viscosity and electrical conductivity. And I think that helped to inspire Lenny's quantum version of the stretched horizon. And incidentally, since you mentioned LIGO, and I'm from Caltech, of course, maybe that should have been my answer to the most beautiful experiment, because, golly, just think about it. A couple of black holes merge billions and billions of years ago, and today a wave washes over the Earth that stretches and contracts the Earth by about the size of an atomic nucleus, and an instrument can detect that. I mean, that's just such a wonderful story.
Oh, yes, it is. Quite phenomenal, and especially the technological challenges and the story behind it, almost getting canceled many times, and kind of emerging from an unlikely team of rivals between rival beavers, as we described earlier. So I have a quick question for you from Ernesto Eduardo de Marginez again. Thank you so much, Ernesto. He's asking a very simple question. What happens to a Lagrange point, such as L1, when 2 black holes merge?
You mean, so I guess it's a question about the orbits around the black holes. I don't think it's really a general relativity question.
Yeah.
It's a question about, orbital mechanics. Well, okay, maybe it's a question about general relativity because you can't ignore curvature uh, for the orbits he's talking
Right.
about. Um, well, it's already complicated when you have two black holes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I should confess I don't really know exactly.
Yeah, I
Uh,
assume your
but
colleague Sterl Finney could present some approach. I'll try to
right,
get Sterl on to answer that question, Ernesto. Thank you.
well,
Uh,
he'll know.
and a question as we kind of wrap up that I've always wanted to ask you. I've asked this of Sean Carroll, who's your Caltech colleague. He's been on the show multiple times, and that is whether or not these mathematical objects are real in the sense that we talk about reality, materialism, etc. Sean's given many talks about concepts like God, religion, etc., that they are less likely to be true because there are simpler entities and universes that could be imagined and are not instantiated, such as a Hilbert space with no objects within it. Before we get to maybe the politics and God section of this podcast, I want to ask you: is Hilbert space real? Does it exist? Does it predate the universe? What's your notion of the reality? Which came first, the Hilbert space or the egg universe?
Well, I guess that's a pretty deep question. I should say, when it comes to mathematics, um, my view is that maybe this is a little bit iconoclastic, I'm not sure, is that what's true and false in mathematics is, in a sense, a question about physics. Um, what do I mean by that? I mean, mathematicians are interested in what they can prove, and a proof is something that you can verify, and the verification is some kind of physical process. So you can always formulate it in the form of some experiment that you do by manipulating objects. Maybe it's running a computer program, and you can check all the steps and see if they follow within the logical system that you formulated. Now, the set theorists have these wild imaginations and invent incredible transfinite worlds that seem far beyond the world we can ever experience. But nevertheless, they make statements about those which are logically verifiable, and that verification is something I would think of as in the domain of physics because it's some machine or something that checks that the steps are really consistent with the rules. As for does Hilbert space really exist? Um, well, yeah, it's a good question. We have a growing prejudice, which I sort of referred to in among those who study quantum gravity, that space is an effective concept. Not it's emergent. It's not really at the bottom of things. That under the right conditions, something that we can describe as space as we study it in ordinary particle physics, in particular with the finite speed of light, that emerges as an approximation from some more fundamental description. And I mentioned the idea of holographic duality. That's sort of a manifestation of that in a certain setting. That there really are things that happen there which are non-local, which you might think of as, information traveling faster than light, but it's still a very, very good approximation under the right conditions to use our usual rules of Einstein's space-time. Um, I don't, I'm not aware of a similar, deeper description in which Hilbert space is emergent that I have found leads to useful insights. So I certainly can't rule it out. But as of now, I'm not aware of a good incentive to think of Hilbert space as emergent. Maybe Sean would disagree with that.
Yes, he does put a lot of stock in Hilbert space, as I've come to realize over time. So we are going to wrap up soon. I want to make one last plea to please be generous with your donations to the Foothill Community Center. I'll put this back up on the screen so that you may gaze upon this wonderful organization that John and I are raising funds for. We've had over almost $100 that will be donated so far. I'd love to even up that, maybe even double it. Thank you so much for your generosity to my just my cherished audience. I love you guys, and look, stay tuned for many more wonderful interviews with intellects. We didn't get to any of the quantum computing fundamental physics links, John. I hope we'll be able to do a part 2 at some point, maybe with Gerard, or maybe we'll do it with Lenny. We'll get we'll get a live stream cage match between friends. Maybe Sabina. I'll get Sabina in here. That'll be fun. I know my audience would like to see that. She doesn't like to debate anymore. We did do a debate this summer about theories of everything with Max Tegmark, Lee Smolin, Stefan Alexander, Lisa Randall, Sabina, Eric Weinstein, and I believe I didn't miss anybody out. And that was really fun. But she said that's basically the last time she's going to do a live chat like that. Not because she had a bad time, but just she feels her energy is best used elsewhere. But anyway, I'd love to get you back to actually talk about the fundamental physics implications and opportunities that quantum computing could provide. So maybe on the before your book comes out, I'll use it as a marketing tool to get more attention to your book, which I can't wait to get my hands on, get a signed copy, like I gave you a signed copy of Losing the Nobel Prize not too long ago. All right, so John, the last 3 questions I ask my cherished guests involve basically Arthur C. Clarke in one form or another. And that is really thinking about the future and thinking about the past, advice to your former self. But I'll ask you the first one, which actually comes from my religion of Judaism, which is known originally as an ethical will, or a zava'ah. And it's not too dissimilar from what good old Alfred Nobel did when he endowed this golden medallion that Frank Wilczek left on my couch earlier this week. And that was that the Nobel Prize had to be given to those who had these great inventions or discoveries in physics that caused the greatest benefit to humanity. In other words, the will was not just about money and giving away attention. It was to advocate for the improvement of the human condition. So it was an ethical will in addition to being a material will. And it kind of encapsulated his wisdom and his hopes for the future. He had no children. He was not married. So this is really his ideological heir. I want to ask you, John, for both your biological progeny and your ideological progeny, which I count myself as one influenced by you, what ethical or piece of wisdom do you want to leave for the future so that people can benefit perhaps in the way they live their life? Maybe not related to physics at all, but in terms of the wisdom that you've developed during your time on this spinning blue marble that we call home.
Well, that's a big question. I guess it would just be keep a sense of humor. Don't take yourself too seriously. It's okay to be self-confident and arrogant sometimes, but recognize your own foibles and limitations, and appreciate that one's idiosyncrasies can be kind of funny. It's okay to make fun of yourself. You mentioned one of my favorite Feynman quotes too, which has related wisdom. You're the easiest person to fool. Try to be honest. It's hard because we do have biases, but we have to do our best to make judgments that are sound, even about ourselves.
Yeah. Very, very, very sage advice. Okay, the next question also goes into the future, and that is related to the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, based on the Arthur C. Clarke book. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but it opens.
Oh, I saw it when it first came out.
Wow.
I was 16, I think. Wasn't it 1969?
Yeah.
And my brother and I, it was in limited engagement in downtown Chicago. We were living in the suburbs. We took the train in because we were so excited to see it. And We spent countless hours afterwards trying to figure out what it was about.
Yeah,
But it was an amazing cinematic experience.
it was. Yeah, Kubrick is just the highlight of basically pinnacle of science fiction movies, in my opinion. But that movie opens with these hominid-like creatures on the plains of Africa, presumably, millions of years ago, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they come upon this monolith, this mysterious object on the savannah, and they hit it with a bone, and they do all sorts of crazy stuff to it. And then later, astronauts encounter the same menacing, monolith on the moon and space, etc. And it's clearly meant to be some sort of time capsule. For what purpose, we don't really know. I asked Avi Loeb last week what he would put on it, and he thinks we've been visited by one of these monoliths. But you stay tuned. 2 weeks from now, I'll have Avi Loeb on my podcast for the release of his new book called Extraterrestrial. That's just a plug, so make sure you subscribe. But I want to ask you, if you had a monolith, it sort of reminded me of Richard Feynman, his, again, making an appearance on this show. He said that if in some cataclysm, all scientific knowledge were to be destroyed, and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? I won't say, I'm sure you know what he said, but I want to ask you, scientific or otherwise, I don't care what you put on it. It could be a quote, it could be your tattoo. It could be the tattoo you have on your backside. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have one of those. But John, what would you put on a billion-year lasting, enduring time capsule, wisdom, knowledge, scientific or otherwise?
Right. Well, Feynman said everything's made of atoms.
Right.
And of course, that's a very good answer. And he meant that you can understand a lot of things just starting from that principle. I guess maybe I would be trying to convey not necessarily the content of science, but how to do science, the method of science. And well, actually, Feynman said something good about that too, right?
Yeah.
In The Character of Physical Law, he said when you're trying to guess or understand the laws of nature, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how important you are. If it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. And so I think the idea that we have to look at the world with objectivity, we have to evaluate the evidence, and if we have pet ideas that we favor, we have to, be willing to test them, and if they fail, we move on.
And in the case of a situation where we can't get experimental evidence, say for the singularity at the core of a black hole or the origin of the universe in a singularity event, I actually revealed, which I didn't know, but Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time was really an advocacy of this Hartle-Hawking, no boundary condition, and he used that for a particular purpose. In his case, I'll talk about it on my podcast with Leonard Mlodinow, which comes out this coming Tuesday. But nevertheless, it was kind of an advocacy against a supernatural creator's necessity, because one of the jobs of a supernatural creator would be to create the universe. And if the universe can emerge from nothing, essentially, in this no boundary, or if time itself can emerge from nothing, maybe such an entity is not necessary. But nevertheless, getting back to Feynman, if it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. What if you can't do the experiment? What do you do?
Keep trying. Keep thinking about it. Unless you have some entirely convincing argument that it's impossible to test the idea, keep trying.
Great. Okay, John, last question. Now we're going to go backwards in time, and we're going to use the famous 3 laws of Arthur C. Clarke, the opening one of which opens the podcast, and that is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I love that quote. I love his second law of Arthur C. Clarke is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. And I think Feynman said science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, something like that. But the third law is the name of this podcast, and it involves basically the following sentence. The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. So that's where I got the name of the podcast. So I want to ask you, John, what aspect of life seemed impossible to a 20-year-old, 30-year-old John Preskill. But because of your courage, because of your integrity, because of your strength of character, whatever, you made it possible. What advice would you give to the young John Preskill to venture beyond his comfort zone into the impossible?
Well, there are several questions there all rolled up into one, it seems. Well, this doesn't directly answer your question about advice to the young John Preskill, but we did encounter in the early days of quantum computing, and to some degree even today, the objection or the viewpoint that scaling up quantum computing is impossible. And the basis for that, well, different people might have different reasons for raising that objection, but I remember in the mid-'90s, very, very good physicists like Bill Unruh. He'd be a good guest on your show.
Yes, I'd love to have him on. Yeah, I talked to Lenny about that. Yep.
And also Rolf Landauer and Serge Haroche and others argued, we'll never be able to get a quantum computer to work, and it's because of decoherence. Well, that in particular for Unruh and Haroche, that was the reason. And Haroche knew very well because he'd worked very hard for a long time to study decoherence in the lab. It's just too pervasive, it's too unavoidable, and it's impossible to get around it. But we developed this idea of quantum error correction, which I think in its long-term implications is as important as the idea that there are quantum algorithms that can greatly outperform classical ones. And so now, most people who think seriously about it believe we will have large-scale quantum computers and will protect them against decoherence using this idea of quantum error correction. So that was interesting to see that unfold. As far as advice I might give to myself, I'm sure I wouldn't have paid attention to my own advice, by the way, but I probably, when I was a young theorist, maybe starting graduate school, there were certain things I was interested in and many things that I thought just aren't that interesting. And one thing that might have been good advice for me at the time was pay more attention to experiments. And I don't just mean the results of them, but experimental techniques, what people actually do in the lab to make stuff work. I didn't learn much about that in my PhD education, and I think if I had, I would have a better understanding even today of the practice of doing really hard experiments, which of course is very relevant to trying to develop quantum computers.
Absolutely, and that brings up my last imprecation or for the future, that people should not be so siloed. I always say to my students who are experimentalists that they don't need to be theorists. They don't need to come up with new theories and so forth, but they need to understand the theory. Otherwise, they're just kind of mindlessly applying the principles of electronics and plumbing and so forth, and they're really not fulfilling their potentiality to become merchants of truth and understand the essence of what they're doing rather than just doing it to get a PhD, et cetera. I'd love to talk to you because you are such an inspiring teacher and mind and so forth. I'd love to talk to you someday about pedagogy and especially, as I said, when your book comes out, but maybe even before that, because I think I've learned so much from you. You didn't maybe ever hear it before now, but you're one of my mentors in a remote sense. I look up to you. I use you as sort of a as a filter. You won't like that, but you're kind of my. If it's interesting to Preskill, it's got to be interesting enough for Keating. So I want to thank you, John, for going into the impossible with me, and I hope you stay well. I hope we see each other. Barry Barish is offering to interview me for my podcast. He has some questions to ask me, so I might come up to Pasadena. I'd love to see you and just get a socially distanced, fist bump from you. I don't know. John, stay well. Thank you for going into the impossible. Everybody, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you for all your donations. You can still give to the Foothill Unity Center. It's a phenomenal organization. And we raised about $100, maybe a little bit more. We'll tally it up afterwards from around the world. I mean, you'll tell them, John, that they got money from Australia and from the UK as well as from San Diego. John, thank you so much.
This has been fun, Brian. I'd be happy to do it again sometime.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Stay tuned for more episodes of Into the Impossible. Leonard Mlodinow, Avi Loeb, We have Deepak Chopra in a solo episode, and hopefully we'll get people like Gerard Tehooft and others back on the show. That would be such a treat. John, thank you so much. Stay well.